Hey everyone, I think we are live now. We're live streaming our third annual Survivor Support Summit this year. I'm really excited for all of our different panels, and we just came out of our breathwork session in person. So it feels really good to do these things in person. And we'll close out tonight with a live in-person open mic if you want to make it there. But for this panel, we're going to be talking about survivor safety and what safety and comfort looks like for survivors. So just to quickly introduce myself, I'm Tiffany. I'm on the Asian Mental Health Project team. I support with website design and content on the side. So really excited to moderate this panel and really passionate about this topic. And I will pass it to Carla or Danielle to introduce themselves.
Hi, everyone. My name is Danielle Espinosa, pronouns she, they. I am a mental health therapist, a marriage and family therapist, and professional clinical counselor. I'm also an author. I have published research regarding counseling Asian American female survivors of sexual assault, particularly with an understanding of how they experience racialized sexism, including like hypersexualization, fetishization, etc. Yeah, and I predominantly work with Asian American adults as well as survivors of interpersonal violence. And excited to be here, honored to be here.
Yeah, I'll go next. Hi, everyone. My name is Carla Aguilar Marquez. I use she, her, ella pronouns. And I'm currently joining you all from Tongavar, which is Los Angeles, the traditional lands of Gabrielino and Tongva peoples. I am currently a graduate student at UCLA PhD program in higher education. And the way I describe like my work and research is that I really, work to serve and support survivors of sexual violence, especially on campuses, college campuses. And so part of my work is research on healing and policy and support, but also as an advocate. So I work at an advocacy center providing holistic support for student survivors who are hoping to connect with staff and community on campus at UCLA. And so I've been in higher ed in the work for like over 10 years. And a lot of it has been in like prevention education, community advocacy work, also publishing research and work. And so I'm really excited to be here and to join y'all in the conversation.
Nice. Thank you for the intros. And so awesome and lovely to hear what you do. For both of you, really curious how you both got into your individual work for supporting survivors and survivor advocacy. Love to hear about that.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be happy to start. Yeah, so I came to this work and I always talk about how much important, our stories and, like our experiences and our identities are so critical to, I think, the work that we do and the purpose behind it. And so I'm a first gen, student. My parents are immigrants to this country. My dad's from Oaxaca, an indigenous person in our family. And my mom's from Central America, from Honduras. So when I think about lineage and I think about experience as, coming here as an immigrant child, and I think about, schooling, I think about experiences on my family, my parents, and so much is there, right? That I think shapes the way we navigate and why I attended, college and education and access and so many different things. But, helping people, I think, is something that is a big part of my family and in our hearts. And so, going to college was really a big thing in my family as first gen. And so I went into college not knowing what I wanted to do. I was like, what is college? What does this mean? What is a major? But quickly I find myself like kind of navigating ethnic studies, anthropology, kind of these cultural aspects around community and community work. And I didn't realize that I could do that as a profession. Like, wow, like I can go into social work or I can learn about people's experience with violence. And so those were kind of the first kind of spaces and conversations that kind of introduced me into what the concept of, violence was, how to support folks who are navigating and how to create change. And it wasn't until my college experience, when I experienced sexual violence as a student there, that I realized the work and the support, right, that was available, but also wasn't available when it came to navigating resources, healing, and support. And so as a student, I quickly connected with, a women's resource center, right? An advocate was someone who was really special in my life. During that time, navigating resources, my family was, a support system that was really supportive. And I realized how much that was a big part in shifting, how to kind of turn, what had happened to me into a way to be really active in the community, right? Policies, prevention, and so that space was really special. And so after that, I decided to, again, right after graduation, everyone kind of goes through that, like, what do I do with my life, right? What is this? What is this? And that's when I found social work. And social work for me, pursuing that, I felt was, kind of that next step of learning tools, like learning frameworks for how to approach, sexual violence. And I think for me, what I always felt kind of lacking in kind of navigating the systems in the space was that it was really Western. It was really white. Like a lot of the curriculum and what I was learning in policies and, the services being offered in some of these spaces were really white and Western, and really didn't focus on the intersections and the identities and the practices and the lived experience of, people of color, of my experience, of my intersections. And so it came to a point, and as I was graduating, working in different campuses, working in the community, especially on campuses, I felt like lacked, like in the sense of like, this isn't it. Like minoritized students who are minoritized by the system, aren't seeing themselves in the research, not in the policies, they're not seeing their families. And for me, I was like, all right, well, if it's not there, like, I guess I'm going to figure out, how to get our stories into research, get our stories into, these curriculums that are also mentoring our next generations. And so I signed up and, I'm in my second year of the program and still figuring things out. But it's been such an awesome healing space to be in community with students, other survivors, other practitioners, faculty, who really see the value and how transformative the work that we do really is. And so that's a little bit about how I got into the work.
That's awesome. Thank you for sharing such a personal story as well. I feel like the context of all this support is really important. And it's great that you saw it and was like, I'm going to make it for myself. I love that attitude. Cool.
Thank you.
And I'm very glad you had your family and all these different support systems as well still to feel that way. Thanks.
Thank you.
Danielle, what about you?
Yeah, I think I see a lot of parallels like in our journeys. One in the sense that my parents also immigrated. They both immigrated from the Philippines, and although they were college educated in the Philippines, I mean, granted those systems were set up by American colonization. There was this expectation of you go to college, you do often like a helping profession. So I was originally like a nursing major going into college. I knew that I wanted to help people. But I didn't quite understand how I wanted to help people. And at this point, I didn't even know what a therapist was. I didn't know what therapy was. That was also part of the motivation of, going into this work, is that I didn't have the language for my own experiences with like mental illness and trauma and like what support could look like for someone with my experience, especially in like Asian American culture and like specifically like Filipino culture. And so in college, had also experienced like my own personal traumas, own sexual violence. And when seeking out support, again, like I didn't know what professional support existed, but received support from friends who saw it as, your compassion is now deepened for like this community, this work. I ended up like switching majors, interning at like a mental health clinic where I finally learned what a therapist was. And granted, this was my last semester of college. I had no idea what I was doing in my life. But found out what a therapist was, found out like what mental health and like mental support could look like, what therapy could look like, and completely transformed everything. And I knew that I wanted to become a therapist. I knew I wanted to specialize working with Asian American communities to help destigmatize what mental illness and what like seeking support could look like. And I knew that I wanted to work specifically with survivors of sexual violence. And when I started doing like practicum work, started seeing clients, it became quite jarringly like pervasive of how pervasive domestic violence is. Even if I were seeing a client who reported like anxiety or like depression, almost always if when we dug through their history, there was some form of like domestic violence, whether that was like an abusive partner, emotionally abusive, oftentimes sexual violence, at least like sexual harassment. To realize how prevalent this issue is across almost all of my clients had experienced like some degree of like sexual violence or gender-based violence, and how that really worked to inform the work, but also show how important, how pertinent, like being, of course, like trauma focused, trauma aware, trauma informed, like how important that is to the work and continues to be a part of the work now. And in my master's program, I was able to conduct research. I specifically focused on like counseling Asian American survivors, particularly with a focus on like the history of like white sexual imperialism. I think of like comfort women and how, Asian women's bodies were essentially like reduced to like sex toys during like World War II by like U.S. military, Japanese military, and how that's contributed to Asian women being hypersexualized, fetishized, how that makes us more vulnerable to sexual violence, to sexual assault, to sexual harassment, and integrating that awareness and that social lens into the treatment work to validate like my client's experience, that it's not just a singular event, but pervasive all throughout their lives because of societal expectations. Yes, that's a glimpse of how I've gotten into the work.
Yeah, it's like the glass breaking when you realize all of these things that are impacting one topic. So, thank you for sharing more about that. And it sounds like along the path, just finding different things and realizing different things to kind of get you where you are now, which is great. Cool. And it sounds like both of you guys work in research, and so have been involved in research that focuses on survivors. So I'd love to hear about how you think research can be used as a tool to help support survivors too.
Totally. I mean, speaking from the clinical lens, but I think this is true off of all areas of research, that it currently focuses predominantly on white, cisgender, heterosexual individuals, and oftentimes men. And so it really, I mean, from a clinical stance, it sort of creates this generalization that, well, if it works clinically for white men, it should clinically work for everyone else. But obviously that's not true, especially when we're thinking about sexual trauma, because unfortunately it does affect women more. Not to say that, of course, men don't experience sexual violence, but it predominantly affects women. Again, I wanted to focus specifically on research that focuses on the intersection of like racialized sexism in terms of Asian American women. Also because there's this generalized belief that like white women, the clinical implications that work for white women can apply for Asian women, which is simply not true. And that need to contextualize history with like white sexual imperialism. And it just allows for like a more nuanced approach when working with all the various intersections. Like I would love if there was more research like on every single intersection, whether that's like Black, Brown, Latinx, Asian, and like the intersections of gender and like transgender folk and like disabled bodies, disabled bodies. Unfortunately, again, like it all sort of centers on like white cisgender heterosexual individuals, and it's very invalidating to our unique experiences to say that it all just applies or we should all be treated the same. Granted, that's just a clinical approach. I'm sure Carla, like who's deep in the research, has a lot of thoughts that I'm very excited to hear.
That's really interesting because it's like the making sure that everyone's represented in research so that practices like on the ground can be applied based on who you are. So that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, Carla, curious about your thoughts.
Yeah, no, I think, Danielle, you make like such an excellent point of highlighting the specific needs and the experiences and the lenses of how we contextualize like history. Like you mentioned colonization, you mentioned immigration, violence, all these things shape the way that families, students, survivors, community experience violence, sexual relationship violence, right? And we don't live in these silos. And a lot of my research and my work brings in and contextualizes a lot of that history. Like I look at a lot like intersectionality theory, a lot around colonization, settler colonization, and a lot of it is about how these systems, right? And I think about systemic work, and what research can do for systemic work is really start to dismantle and start to pull apart these kind of frameworks and boxed ideas that we're often taught, not just in K through 12 education, but the way that someone is trained in a clinical program, the way that we do in-services from an organization that like checks off our accreditation and our licenses, right? These are the kind of the gatekeepers who teach other people how to also serve our community, not just ourselves. And so I think it's really important. And as I was alluding to earlier, that so much of that curriculum and so much of that training is, and the research isn't often done by our own people in our own community. It's often, even though we know the medicine, we know the experiences, the practices that have been passed down by our ancestors or our mentors, our scientists and all these different things, it's often written about us from other people. And so part of why I think for me research is so important is because we start to elevate and explore and forefront our people and our traditions, our stories, our experiences as knowledge, legitimate knowledge in the way that we serve and work with survivors, right? And so I think about the tools that people learn in programs. I think about models like frameworks around like, CBT or, like equity. What does equity mean like for people? What does that mean in practice, right? Is it coming from kind of this white savior, let me help you, like you're going to do what you're like I tell you to do, versus like a community-based model, right, where everyone has input on shaping services and programs. And so I think there's a really systemic piece to it that's really important. For me, it's also honoring, that knowledge that's really sacred from our family and our community, whether that's spiritual, religious, whether that's in community, whether that's teachings from our families, traditional medicine, all these things that are also really important in the way that minoritized folks, survivors of color, undocumented survivors are navigating their healing for themselves, right? So I think that's a really particular important thing as a tool to really shift the systemic pieces around how we're supporting survivors. The other thing, and I'll share a little bit more about my research specifically a little later, but research can be really healing, right? And when I think about activism and when I think about, tools, a lot of people think of research, and because historically research has been a very exploitative, white kind of people coming in saying, give us your stories, and then bouncing, like we call that drive-by research, and then not even caring about, the impact that it had on a community, the tools that they're building. But when it's done, with love, with care, with commitment to really changing these experiences and systems, I think it can be so transformative, not only for the researcher and myself, the person who's doing the work, and spending time and listening and holding space with the survivors that I'm working with has just been so transformative and incredible, but also for themselves, right? Like being the center in a space where they can be the focal point of sharing their experience, being validated, being heard, being seen, I think is such a healing space in that way. And so I think research in that way can be really healing. And also it kind of takes away this idea that like knowledge and research has to be this very scientific, which I think is really pushed by our like producing, like capitalistic, like this is what knowledge is. But when we think of our lived experiences, that's legitimate just as anything else. And so forefronting that, I think, can make also research really healing like in that way.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And curious, you mentioned, I'm very curious about each of your guys' own research and if there's anything interesting that you found or can share.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of my research, and I love, it's really hard to describe it sometimes when I'm actually like, I have like ideas and thoughts. And so a lot of my projects and my, like the work that I published has mostly been, and I say that I I went into research, and my purpose in work is really to work with students, like minoritized students. Like I do research, I write to them, to our community. And so it's really all about them always, and about us and our stories and our identities. So a lot of like my work has been on how survivors engage in healing, whether that's through intergenerational relationships, whether that's with their ancestors, whether that's with relationality to land, to water, how they're engaging in that type of healing. And a lot around like persistence and what they need on college campus to really support. But specifically right now, one of the projects that I'm really excited about, and just it's been such an experience, has really focused on space and place, and a lot of, and the relationship that survivors have it with space and place after they've experienced violence, whether on campus or off, and the role that has in shaping their experience, but also healing their experiences. And so I know, Danielle, you mentioned pieces around colonization, history, perceptions. And one of the things that also comes up a lot for students is that when we experience violence in community or spaces where violence is perpetuated, and often people don't think about a college dorm, or they think about a community on campus that once felt safe and now is different because of victimization. Historically, spaces and places have memory. They have experiences that are also a part of a survivor's victimization and their healing. And so the project is really focusing on exploring the spaces and places where survivors heal. And it can be, it can be everything from like, this is a botanic garden, a garden where I come to that I feel heal and I engage in my own healing. That's a part of me feeling connected to community. It can be a political organization, like, a student might experience violence on campus that happened from someone in the community, but part of their persistence and transforming their experience of violence into an empowerment, connected to purpose, wanting to do something about it, is part of a student organization where they feel seen in their identities, right? And they feel validated, and turning that experience into something that's also healing, right? And so a lot of it has emerged. There's a lot of, students who are talking about all these things, but I think for me, the most memorable has just really been learning how survivors are utilizing water, land, and space to facilitate their healing, right? And like one of the examples that, a student, and I'm constantly learning, right? And I think that's the beautiful thing about learning from community, is like what water and plants have to teach us about ourselves and about healing, right? And we often, I think living in LA, right, it's like concrete and freeways, and you start to feel really disconnected, from the ocean, because it's like 30 minutes to get there, sometimes an hour. But you live in this really productive, fast-paced life, and students finding these pockets where they are leading to like a tree, like a lake, a botanic garden on campus, and plants teaching them how to water. They're like, when I tend for my plants, when I spend time watering them, cutting their leaves off, it's a teaching tool for myself to also drink water, to also tend to myself. So it's like learning how to take care of yourself through taking care of other things, pets, like all these different things, right? So there's a lot more, but I also want to make space for Danielle to share more about that too.
Yeah, they need more of those on campus just to have that space for people. Yeah, Kira and Danielle, very curious about yours as well.
Totally. So as I've mentioned, my research focuses on like counseling Asian American survivors. And I mean, the way that I conduct my research was interviewing clinicians who specialize in working with this population. And some of the concerns that often came up, like in these interviews, with their experiences working with this population, is how there's often like a resigned acceptance to the violence, to the sexual violence, to the trauma, due to like cultural expectations or cultural values. This idea that, as a wife or as a partner, as a woman, this is just part of the role. This is part of the relationship. This is our role as women, that, we are expected to submit or to just go along with the violence, and, to feel very powerless, and even to an extent, like blame ourselves for the violence that we've experienced, whether it was because we were being too nice, or we didn't stand up for ourselves, or we were wearing this, or we were like drinking that. So there's a sort of like resigned acceptance, and a lot of the clients who would come in describing the violence, the domestic violence, the abuse that they experienced, would not even recognize the experience as abuse, or they would not like be angry like at what occurred to them. And along that note, it wasn't until the experience was contextualized, like among the family, for example. So the clinician would ask, would you want your daughter to experience this? Like, would you want your friend to experience this? Could you imagine your son engaging in the behavior that, your husband engages in? And that's when it would sort of a click for them, when they would contextualize it for family. So integrating those collectivistic values, integrating the familial lens, and how that would move them, that would empower them to recognize the gravity of the trauma, and to like undergo the healing, do the work, seek support. Another aspect that came up often was the like layers of shame when it comes to trauma, because sexual violence is already such a shameful experience, whether that's because, we blame ourselves for the trauma that we endured, we say that like it was our fault, we shouldn't have been there, or even just the general feeling of like feeling dirty, let's say, especially in this like purity culture that we exist in, how there's so much shame just from the trauma itself, but also the way that I think shame is such a pervasive element in Asian American culture, where we shame ourselves for not getting straight A's, or we shame ourselves for like not being a doctor. How shame is used as a sort of toxic motivator for self-improvement, and how our families shame us, also from like seeking help, from seeking support. So a lot of the work that clinicians did with their clients was addressing that shame, to know that it wasn't their fault, that they are still worthy, they're still valuable despite not being a doctor, despite the trauma that was inflicted upon them. And a lot of the ways that this work would be done, which I'm so happy about, like, the session this morning, is that a lot of these clients would resonate with like a lot of somatic healing, whether that was like mindfulness or grounding, EMDR, and the way that that targets the trauma in a very like somatic way versus like traditional talk therapy. Integrating those practices to address the shame, to address this, the self-blame, were shown to be like very powerful. So that's what I uncovered with my research.
That's awesome. It's so exciting to actually hear like your individual work and some projects that you're really excited about. I think one thing that was kind of brought up, but I'd love to delve into a little bit more, is especially around individuals feeling a like loss of the sense of their safety. So not feeling safe in their own space or in their own family or anything like that, either during its present trauma or post trauma. So I'm really curious about how you guys think that could manifest in an individual when they feel like they've lost their sense of safety. Danielle, do you want to kick it off?
Totally. So the way that I see this with my clients is that often the presenting concern that they're coming in, that they're wanting to work in, can often be reframed as like a protective tool. So I think about the clients who engage in like isolation. They'll cut off friends, they won't check their phone, they'll sort of like box themselves in their homes. And I see that as, well, you're protecting yourself from future violence, you're protecting yourself from experiencing shame, whether that's like not wanting people to like blame you for the trauma. Again, like that perception of like, I feel dirty, I don't want people to see like how quote unquote like dirty I am. So it makes sense, like you are protecting yourself from, again, like future violence, experiencing shame. Even clients who engage in substances, like you're protecting yourself from experiencing the emotional trauma. You're protecting yourself from experiencing like the pain. You're doling out like your traumatic symptoms. Absolutely makes sense. Or even clients who like deny their experience or invalidate their experience. They say like, oh, it wasn't that bad, like it could have been worse. At least like this didn't happen. They're protecting themselves from recognizing the gravity of the trauma. So I see it all as like the self-protection tools, because their safety has been stolen in that way, like safety within their body. Also the loss of confidence, the loss of trust in yourself. If you don't feel safe in your body, granted, like you won't feel safe anywhere because this is the only vessel that you have. So there's that loss of like the confidence, loss of trust in their self. I see that a lot in clients who were either in like abusive relationships, because now they feel that they can no longer trust themselves to find a worthwhile partner, or they can't trust themselves to engage in positive relationships because they blame themselves of, well, my radar was off. I should have like seen this coming. I should have known that he was a bad guy. So there's that loss in safety, like loss of internal safety and how they trust themselves, how they proceed forward. And also, of course, like the external safety of like, if you're still with an abusive partner, like you live with them, of course you're not going to feel safe. You can't heal while you're still in the environment that traumatized you. So there's lots of layers of safety, but also ways that we tend to like protect ourselves.
I feel like it can manifest in a lot of different ways. And so that's why it's important to have the research to understand that they're all connected. But it's really interesting. Carla, what about you?
Yeah, no, I mean, just to echo Danielle's like point, and I love that, Danielle, you're talking about this holistic person, right? Because we are holistic and we have these multiple dimensions in terms of, our internal selves, ourselves, the way our relationships with community, with family, and, the survivors that I work with, everything's really transformed. It's really shifted, right? When someone experiences sexual relationship violence. And so it's often very like what Danielle was saying, right? The loss of control, right? Trying to figure out and cope what's happening with your body, your emotions, your mind. And I often think about the impact that starts to have on safety, like externally, right? The places where you're visiting, whether you feel comfortable now in a group setting, or whether, for example, if it was someone who harmed you in your own community, in your own group, right? Like figuring out what safety means when you're going to the grocery store, or when you're seeing them at a coffee shop where you were frequenting, right? All those things really start to shift, I think, for folks when that happens, and more critically when there's multiple victimizations, right? I think often people think it's a one-time experience, but for a lot of communities, especially communities of color, victimization, and I think Danielle, alluded to it, there's catcalling, there's sexual violence, there's relationship violence, in domestic violence, there's sexual violence, right? Like all these multiple layers of trauma really start to really deregulate what's happening in the mind and the body, right? Somatically, all these different things. And so I think one of the things that's often also, I feel like, left out of, the research and sometimes the work, because sometimes folks might feel like it's a scary place to trek, or maybe it's uncomfortable, when at the moment, but, some of the things that like, I think has really been highlighted in the work that I found is this notion of intimacy and sexual healing. What happens with your sexual needs and bodies, right? When you've experienced sexual relationship violence, when you're with a new partner, right? And so I think there's a piece of reclamation, of empowerment, of healing, and a process that also is very personal in that healing process. And so regaining safety to what that means, right, in your body and with relationships and with people and trust and community again is something that I think is really important. And there's a lot of work from Dr. Jennifer Gomez, who does work on cultural betrayal trauma theory, and I think about, right, oppression, and I think about how our experiences are only lived in one identity, right? And Danielle, you mentioned earlier about, survivors with disabilities who are also Asian American, right? What does that experience look like in terms of safety and accessing resources? But Dr. Gomez's work does a lot around cultural betrayal trauma theory, which I think gets at the nooks of harm that happens within our own families, right? And even though we often don't talk about it in our families, or it's very stigmatized, and there's a lot of unsafeness and fear when the harmer is a family member or someone in your own like community work, right, who's also harming other people. And so it always goes back to also that individual of those intersections, and what safety like means for them and what it doesn't mean for them can be also very personal and political, like in that way.
Yeah, thank you for both of these answers. And now that we've talked about that, I'm also very curious about what you think about tips for someone to support themselves or heal with themselves, or help other people heal in their sense of community, if they know that they're feeling some loss of safety, or if they've gone through something similar in experience.
Yeah, so I can just share a little bit more, and I always really go back to kind of like 4 points, and I think it's about um, the number one, and I think the self-talk is always the hardest, right? We can always teach and tell other people like this is what you need to do, but when it comes to turning around and giving ourselves or survivors their own self, it's the hardest work, and I think that's the healing work. But it's really that first piece when someone does disclose to you, right, that they've experienced sexual violence, that they're in a relationship violence situation, is don't judge them. Like, I think that's the biggest thing that a lot of people fear is, what is this person, or where are these people? What is my family going to think about me when I share to them an experience that's happened to me, right? And it goes back to the shame, to the self-guilt, and I'll trust it when, you may have those questions of where were you at, if someone disclosed to you, what were you doing, what were you wearing, were you drinking, all these things, or why are you still in this relationship, right? But that survivor is already asking and putting themselves through that process because of that internalized what society also puts on them, right? And so I think it's really important, not to judge, validate their emotions, let them know they're not responsible for the harm that another person chose to enact on them, right? And being very clear about that. Listening and validating, and then also asking them what they need, right? I think a lot of the time, because we love and we care so much about our community and survivors, and we want to, do things, we often jump into that, maybe often like advising, or this is what you should do, this, and it comes from a place of like wanting to help, right? But really asking them what they need, right? When we think of the dynamic of sexual relationship violence, it's really about power and control, like someone overpowering a choice that they had and the choice they didn't have, right? Or someone making decisions for them when they didn't have a decision in that. And so anything that we can do, and I think that's speaking more to a trauma-informed, healing-centered practice, is giving them back that power, that choice to decide what they need and what is best for them, right? It might not be something that we may agree with or that we think we would do in a situation, but asking what they need in that moment is really important, and probably the most important. And some folks are like, I don't know, I just listen. Or, they might say like, I don't want to talk about it, but just keep me company. Like, or it might be like, I might need a resource. Like, can you connect me to one, right? So really letting them move that forward, what they need, I think is the most important. It's really the first start. And there's actually a lot of research on that first disclosure, that first moment that someone decides to share an experience of violence is the most crucial, because either that person will kind of signal to them like, okay, like I feel a little safer because the response was supportive, so I think I can move along a little bit more. But if the disclosure and the response is negative, it's victim blaming, it's like, I'm going to do everything for you, that might kind of close off someone to be like, this is too much. Like, I'm experiencing more harm in sharing than I did when I didn't, right? And so I think that role of someone sharing with you is very sacred, it's very special. And that person chose to disclose perhaps to you because they could trust that you are helpful in that way, right? So I think that's really, it's an honorable piece too. And the last is just to take care of yourself. I think, we working, and I know probably Daniel can speak to it, it's a lot. So taking care of ourselves, and supporting survivors and ourselves also with experiences is really important.
Yeah, thank you. Those are all good steps. Danielle, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Carla spoke wonderfully about how to support this, like the survivors in our lives, the ones who come to us, disclosing like their trauma, how to support them. Coming from like a clinical standpoint of like how to support yourself, like if you are a survivor yourself, I engage my clients in a lot of like inner child or parts work. So I mean, regardless of like what age the trauma occurred, I still encourage clients to visualize the traumatized part, or the part that experienced the trauma, the part that feels unsafe, as like their inner child, as a little child, and recognizing how like she feels so unsafe in this environment. She feels judged, she feels dirty, she feels like this is her fault, and like all that guilt, all that shame, and talking to that part as if like it is a child. Like, yes, I know, I acknowledge how unsafe you feel right now. A terrible thing was done to you. Your power was stolen. Your safety was stolen. Of course, you would feel terrified in this environment. Of course, you would feel unsafe, like in our body. But can you trust that you, the adult form, the healed form, or the person who's undergoing the healing, can you trust that I'm going to take care of her? Can you trust that I'm going to protect us, and I'm going to, pursue relationships that are good for us, or I'm going to seek support from friends or a mental health professional, or I'm going to like just take care of whatever we need. Like, what do we need right now? Do we need to do like some mindfulness? Do we need to take a warm bath? Do we need to spend time with friends? Do we need to just go in and cry like into our pillowcase? Like, can you trust that I'm going to do whatever it takes to keep us safe? And that ability to like resource safety when, feeling either externally or internally unsafe, the ability to resource safety like for that inner child, for that traumatized part, I think can be a great tool that like my clients can implement when they're feeling unsafe or triggered, and also to help rebuild that trust, right? That rebuild that internal trust in yourself, to know that you can be confident when you go out and interact with people. You can go out when you can feel confident when you go to a party or you socialize, or just to reintegrate back into the world, to know that you are going to keep yourself safe regardless of what happens. So that's just for supporting like your internal self.
Yeah, I love that, especially like about how both of you talked about self-talk, whether it's to yourself and then making sure to express that to your loved ones as well. This is our last question, unfortunately, but I'm very also wanting to hear about how we talked about like comforting people on an interpersonal level, so one-to-one or in a small group or community. But I'd love to hear also how to provide comfort on a systemic level to a larger pool of people, and what that looks like for you.
Definitely. I mean, in a dream world, right? Like, we would overthrow these oppressive, patriarchal, Eurocentric, ableist systems, racist systems, to the point where honestly men don't feel entitled to women's bodies. They don't feel entitled to our bodies, to sex, to smiles walking down the street. To dismantle those patriarchal systems that encourage that sense of entitlement to our bodies. And also, whether that means like having an adequate justice system where they know that when you commit a crime, there will be retaliation, there will be punishment, there will be justice served. Of course, that is in a dream world where we like believe survivors, and where the sexual justice system is adequate, because we know currently, unfortunately, it is not. And to just have those like systemic protections in place where we believe survivors. And Kate Mann has like great research around like the way that like the patriarchy shows up when it comes to survivors. And I think of this term called himpathy, which is the excessive empathy that we demonstrate toward men, especially like assailants. I think of like the infamous like Stanford rape case with Brock Turner, and how these people were saying like, oh, he is a swimmer and he goes to Stanford and now he can no longer like enjoy eating steaks or whatever like BS people were saying. And it's, why are we giving so much sympathy to this person who committed such an atrocity? Why are we not paying attention to the survivor, the person who was traumatized, whose power and safety was stolen from her? Why do we sympathize with these like privileged white men who are committing these like atrocious crimes? And sort of revamping systemic views on patriarchy and like white male entitlement from a systemic like clinical lens. In an ideal world, again, therapy would be more accessible, and it would not be such a privilege or such a luxury. Of course, that means revamping like healthcare systems and insurance, because right now it is not possible to, well, there are avenues, but it's very difficult to get adequate culturally attuned care just through insurance alone. They often like limit how many sessions you can have. They often limit what modality. Also, I mean, 75% of therapists are white, and I'm certain that not many of them understand the nuances of like colonization, of like our history, of just the nuances of like cultural influences, particularly like around like shame or like collectivistic values. And so how do we essentially like rebuild the therapeutic system that it's more accessible but also more culturally knowledgeable to serve wider populations? Of course, I do believe in radical hope and the idea that even just daydreaming about like these possibilities and dreaming about like what could be is like a middle finger to oppressive systems, because they need us to believe that nothing can be changed, right? And just by believing that change can happen is sort of fighting the system in and of itself, to know that, or to believe that this change is possible. So even though it feels far-fetched in our current societal climate, I think we are on the right path, and I think we are having more conversations about how to revitalize our systems. And I think hope is always the proper response.
I love that term, radical hope. Carla, what about you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's so powerful and so important. And I think it's realizing, and I think systemically, and for us, is knowing that we're in it together, right? Like oppression, sexual violence, relationship violence, it's all rooted and comes from these pieces of power, white supremacy. We're looking at racism, sexism, xenophobia, right? And all these things that are happening. And I think being active and knowing to show up in these spaces, because they also impact our survivors and what they think of healing and support and thriving. And, I think about what's happening in Tennessee right now with Representative Jones and what that means for survivors in the state, and us talking about that just as important, right, as eroding rights for survivors in that state with actions that are going to happen with laws and policies, and knowing that that could happen here and everywhere, right? So I think thinking holistically of what advocacy looks like is showing up also in those spaces, to be involved in the conversation, because that's also going to help provide access to survivors that we're serving in community. Looking at restorative, transformative justice and processes, I think are really critical, especially when we're looking at carceral systems, policing that is also founded in very racist notions of serving, community, which may also be traumatizing. But I also want to end on a positive note with Danielle of like radical hope. And, when I started, I was like, I need to do this, I need to do this, I need to do this. And it can also be overwhelming and burnout, right? So what I always like love, and I think that's why I love working with students, is find your role, like your purpose in this work, in this movement, and love it and be passionate about it. It might, you might not be the therapist, you might be the educator, you might be the social media gatherer who brings the tech together to give platforms to like this work, right? And go with it, like, right? We don't have to be good at everything. I think that's the beautiful thing of our work, is that we can help support each other with our strengths. And in my dad's family, we have these traditions and beliefs where we have dones, we have gifts that are passed down to us and given to us by ancestors and our families. And I consider like our family a family of healers, because we also, like, my sister's a therapist, and we're all just like these giving people, right? And we all have those gifts, right? We have those roles, those empathies. We don't need degrees for them. We don't need certificates, right, to validate those gifts and those skills. And I think being that role in that special place in your community, in your org, in your family, like that's powerful, and cultivating and finding purpose in that with hope and with love and care, I feel is the sustainability and the long-term game, which is a long-term process for change, right? And not burning out. Trauma exposure is really big in our field. So taking care of ourselves, I think, is really important to be able to bring in the next generation of folks who are going to continue to work for us as we go in the long run. I love that point. Yeah, that was powerful.
I love both points, radical hope and also making sure to take care of yourself and show compassion to yourself along the way. And also for platforms like these, we don't all have to have the same role. We're just coming together to support, which is awesome. And a lovely note to end on. So I just want to say thank you so much to both of you for taking time out of your day to come and give this panel. And I'm very excited for it to be posted and live streamed. But thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for having us. It's such a pleasure. It was nice to meet you, Carla. Can't wait to connect after this.
Me too. Thank you so much, y'all.